Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is wrapping up a high-stakes visit to China.
Over the past week, I've had the opportunity to make progress on issues that matter to Americans.
It was her second trip to Beijing in 9 months, and improving the relationship between China and the U.S. has been and continues to be a huge focus for Yellen.
It's undeniable that the U.S.-China relationship is on a stronger footing today than this time last year. And this was not preordained. It was the direct result of President Biden's guidance to me and his cabinet to intensify our diplomacy with China.
It is an abnormally large role for Treasury Secretary in diplomatic affairs.
That's Chris Condon, who covers economic policy for Bloomberg. He traveled with Yellen to China.
She's taken very seriously abroad. She has a long history of dealing with economic policymakers, monetary policymakers all over the world for many years. And she just has the chops.
While she was there to talk about opportunities for cooperation between the world's two largest economies, she also didn't shy away from addressing a major national security concern.
We continue to be concerned about the role that any firms, including those in the PRC, are playing in Russia's military procurement. I stress that companies, including those in the PRC, must not provide material support for Russia's war, and that they will face significant consequences if they do.
On today's episode, On the Ground in China with Janet Yellen on what's likely to be her last visit there as Treasury Secretary. From Bloomberg News, this is The Big Take. I'm David Gura. Janet Yellen's trip to China comes at a calmer moment. Uncertainty during the Trump years strained the U.S.-China relationship, and China's zero-COVID policy compounded that. Then there was the Chinese spy balloon found floating above the United States. The U.S. military shot it down just over a year ago.
In the same way that the U.S. was forced to respond, China obviously is also forced to respond when it sees one of its, assets taken out of the sky like that live on cable TV and on Twitter.
That's Enda Curran, who covers the global economy. He's now based in Washington after a decade in Hong Kong.
Both sides were then just pushed into a corner. It was always going to play out the way that it did.
U.S.-China relations reached a new low after that incident, and they stayed there for months.
There was no communications going on at any level, especially in defense, right, and head of government level. And I think both sides realized that they need to come together here and try and get the basic comms lines reopened. And that's what has been happening.
A key moment was late last year when President Biden sat down with President Xi at a summit in California.
We're going to continue to preserve and pursue high-level diplomacy at the PRC in both directions to keep the lines of communication open, including between President Xi and me. He and I agreed that each one of us could pick up the phone, call directly, and would be heard immediately.
Which is what happened a week ago ahead of Janet Yellen's trip. The White House says Biden and Xi had a candid and constructive discussion on a range of issues.
Both sides agreed, let's talk where we can, cooperate where we can, fairly modestly. That might be, of course, on narcotics trade, maybe some work on climate change. But underneath the surface, none of the big geostrategic competitive issues have gone away. It's not like the US concerns over China's competitive advantages have gone away. Now, as you remember well, the President Trump years, we had the introduction of a trade war, which came as a shock to the global system. And this current administration has been pretty hawkish, as hawkish as the previous administration when it comes to keeping those tariffs in place, imposing export restrictions, imposing investment restrictions, and pushing back writ large against China. And of course, from China's side, they are openly courting, if you want to call it, the global south. And of course, China tries to peel off U.S. allies where they can.
China also seems to be courting U.S. business leaders in a way they haven't for a while. You had President Xi sitting down for, 90 minutes with a lot of U.S. executives. What did you make of that meeting, that overture from the Chinese government?
I think it's consistent with this idea that China's trying to say they are open for business. Remember, sentiment has turned so negative towards China, not just on the security front, but in the COVID zero years. Businesses trying to operate there, global companies said this is very difficult. There was a lot of hassle around trying to navigate COVID zero policies. And on the investor portfolio side of things, people can't get their money out of there fast enough. That's not all about geopolitics. It does reflect interest rates as well. But the net result is sentiment is really negative towards China. And I think the Chinese government now get this, and they are pushing a message that we are here, we're open for business.
After the break, the concerns U.S. business leaders asked Janet Yellen to convey to her counterparts about how difficult it is for U.S. companies to compete with their Chinese rivals, and how the Treasury Secretary is trying to maintain a fragile stability ahead of a U.S. presidential election that could upend policies she's put in place. We're back. Before the break, we were talking about how the U.S. and China hope to move forward after years of fraught relations. Chris Condon covers the Treasury Department for Bloomberg, and when I caught up with Chris, he was outside a bar Yellen was visiting in Beijing, known for brewing beer with American hops.
She knocked back a cold one with Nicholas Burns, the U.S. ambassador. So that was kind of fun.
I asked him what Treasury Secretary Yellen hoped to achieve on this trip.
Almost zero, really, in terms of this specific trip. They really tried to frame it as part of a longer process in which they're building relations that will prevent problems from arising and possibly help address longer-term issues that they want to improve on. Also, I should say importantly, help address issues where they feel they have a mutual interest, like climate change or debt relief for poor countries. But I'm going to use this phrase a few times, a bit of a long game. I think for Yellen, personally even, she's searching for a way that communicates to the Chinese why the U.S. is so upset about certain issues. Not just we are upset, but why we are upset, and let's present kind of evidence-based case for it. She's an economist. That's the way her brain thinks.
And she started this visit by gathering more evidence about the challenges of doing business in China.
The very first meeting was not with any Chinese group, but with American and EU, Japanese, and other executives from companies that do business in China. She's kind of trying to arm herself that it's not just about U.S. complaints, but many other countries, and these businesses have these troubles.
The U.S. has accused China of flooding the market with cheap goods for years. And on this trip, Yellen hammered the Chinese government about what's called industrial overcapacity.
China is now simply too large for the rest of the world to absorb this enormous capacity. Actions taken by the PRC today can shift world prices. And when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products, the viability of American and other foreign firms is put into question.
The thing I think that's funny about that is she came here and she really gave them a tongue lashing, and still they're rolling out the red carpet. They really like her. She's seen as a kind of wise elder, a bit of a scholar, not a politician. She comes to deliver a tough message, but still it's like, okay, we still like you, Janet Yellen, and we'll still take you on these VIP tours. And so she still gets the great treatment, even when she lashes them all day long about overcapacity.
And she didn't hold back. Chris says Yellen didn't just hit China on overcapacity. She also threatened to respond more forcefully to any sign Chinese firms are helping Russia.
She leveled a very clear threat, I would say, against the Chinese financial institutions. That if they are involved in transactions, cross-border transactions, that will help the Russians bolster their military, industrial base, which of course we're talking about helping the war in Ukraine. She says the Americans are going to go after that. They would designate Chinese financial institutions. Now, designation, it sounds like, well, what does the U.S. have to say about any of this? The U.S. has a very key power in this whole area, and that is access to U.S. dollars. To access U.S. dollars as a bank, you need either a branch in the U.S. or a correspondent relationship with a bank in the U.S. that has an account in the Fed lets you get dollars. If you don't have that as a bank of any size, anywhere in the world, it's almost like a death sentence. Your clients will flee you very quickly. So that's a very serious threat for her to level, the idea of designating or sanctioning a Chinese financial institution.
But Chris says Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and her colleagues recognize there's only so much they can do ahead of the U.S. presidential election in November. Well, I asked Chris how that affects Yellen's ability to broker deals, given how much uncertainty there is about what will happen in just a few months.
Well, I mean, this is just a question that has to be asked. You know, I talk about them playing a long game. The Chinese can play a long game. How does the U.S. play a long game? I think from Yellen's perspective, she thinks the only way to make progress is to play a long game, and she has to hope for the best. She plays her part during her tenure. It's going to come to an end in January. What can she do about that? She can only pursue the path that she thinks will be most effective and then hope for the best once she's out of this job. We'll see what happens. I don't want to leave you with time, cliche time will tell, but, let's say what will happen on the U.S. side if Biden wins again. They'll have a decent chance of continuing this path with them. It will be a tough sledding at first, but they'll have a chance. If it's a Trump administration, all bets are off, really. Not because I'm saying that they lack the capacity to continue this, but they just simply may lack the will to pursue this the way that Yellen thinks is the best way to pursue it. So there's no really good answer to this. We will have to wait and see.
Thanks for listening to the Big Take podcast from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura. This episode was produced by Jessica Beck. It was edited by Caitlin Kenny and Chris Anstey. It was mixed by Alex Aguirre. Naomi Shavin is our senior producer. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. Special thanks to Gerard DePippo. Please subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.